today's topic is retirement pitfalls to avoid, building a confident plan in 2026. And what we did here was we put together a handful of potential pitfalls to a retirement plan. And some of these you may have already covered. You may have thought about these things and built it into your plan. Others you may have not really thought about. So hopefully there's at least one or two things you can take out of this and implement it with your own plan or know the right questions to ask about your plan. We always like to start, when we start talking about building a retirement plan, the first thing we talk about is just having a vision of what that looks like. So we didn't build a slide for this, but that's always a starting place for us. If you are working your whole life and all you ever know is work, and then all of a sudden you go to having all this free time and you're not working anymore, it's important to have a vision of what do you want that to look like. And if you don't have a vision, it can be hard to really build a plan around that because you're just sitting around on the couch twiddling your thumbs. So always like to start with the vision, but once you have a vision, that's where we get into building this plan. A couple things about 2026. There's a lot of reasons why planning matters at all times, but just a little temperature check. Interest rates are still historically higher than they have been in the last decade. So even though they've been coming down, they're higher than they've been. And we do anticipate they're probably going to keep coming down, but obviously that pace has slowed dramatically from where it was going to be a year and a half ago. We were talking about slashing rates immediately. It was going to go back to, and that just hasn't really happened. So we still think there's probably going to be several cuts this year, though, maybe 3. But we'll see. I mean, things change on a whim anymore, right? And then healthcare and Medicare costs. If you've never really looked at this, the rate at which healthcare costs rise is higher than general inflation. So you have to have a plan for healthcare built into your retirement plan. How are you going to pay for things? And we'll talk about things like long-term care. How do you address those? And then, of course, we're living longer. So the longer you have to plan for, the harder it is to have a plan. If you only need a plan for a 10-year retirement, that's pretty easy. You can close your eyes and do that. If you need a plan for 35 years, that's a lot harder to do. So you don't want to blow your plan in the first 10 years and be like, oh shoot, I forgot about those other 25. So important to know that, it all depends when you retire. If you're retiring at 60 years old, you got to plan for a long retirement. If you're retiring at 70, you got a little less to plan for, but you still have to have a solid plan. So the first one we want to get into here is treating retirement as a one-time event. And I think this can be easy to do because, like I said, you spend all your life working and your focus is, man, I just can't wait to be done. Maybe you're putting in 50, 60 hours a week and the prize is there. You're like, retirement is on the horizon. But retirement is not a one-time event. It's a journey. I mean, it's really, and we break it into 3 stages, which I'm going to go through. But you have to have all of the stages of retirement built into your plan. One of the things that I threw on here is our retirement income analysis. Now, anyone ever log into our client dashboard? A few people? Okay. Well, if you're already a client of ours, you have access to it. We can show you how to use it if you haven't, if you'd like to. If you're not a client, we can show you what that looks like. But this is just one of the tools in there is a retirement income analysis. And the reason I brought this up is this just shows what income sources look like over time. So you see this one has kind of a bow in it where it's a little higher at first and then it dips down, then it kind of goes higher again. Well, we can test an income source against several different possibilities in the future. So what happens if rates go up again? What happens if rates go down? What happens if we go through a bad decade in the stock market? How do those things affect your income? And what you want to see when you do something like that is that most of your income is stable regardless of the potential external event. So if you're lucky enough to have a large pension, that's nice because you have less dependence on the market. But if you don't, you got to make sure that you're planning for these things. So let's break it down. We're going to break down the 3 main stages. And some of you may have heard this terminology before, but the first stage of retirement is what we'd call the go-go years. And for most people, it's like around the first 10-year clip. Okay, now that could be longer or shorter depending on when you retire. But during this phase in your retirement, you're generally more active, you're traveling more, you're remodeling the house, you're getting all those things done that have just been on your list and you just never had time. You always wanted to travel, you wanted to go overseas, but when you were working full-time, building your career, there's just no way. So for most people, this is the time to do it. And you're also, as far as your retirement, you're the healthiest you'll likely be in your retirement. You're still at the young side of retirement. You feel good. You're like, let's go do these things. Let's tackle the world. So that's what we generally see here. Now, this can be a more costly stage of retirement because all those things that you had pushed to the back burner, now is time to do them. And so some of you may resonate with that in here. You may say, you know what? Yeah, we retired, then we went to Europe, and now we're going to New Zealand, and getting all those things done. Or you're remodeling the house. You're redoing the floors. You're doing the new kitchen, things like that. So a lot of upgrades to your lifestyle, things you've wanted to get done, the traveling, and so on. A big potential pitfall in this stage is withdrawing too early. If your portfolio takes a massive hit in the first 10 years, and then it stabilizes after that, well, you've done some damage. So you have to make sure you're not getting too far ahead of yourself with the spending. So that's a potential pitfall to avoid in the first 10 years. First 10 years is also the most important when it comes to your income plan. Because, again, if you do too much damage to your portfolio and the markets don't cooperate, it's hard to recover from that. Now, for most people, the next 10-year clip or so, we call the slow-go years. This is a little bit of shift in mentality. Maybe you're feeling like, okay, we got the traveling out of our system. We traveled for 10 years. Yeah, maybe do some domestic, go see the grandkids, things like that. But you're more of a homebody. You're doing things around town. You're going to the dog groomer. You're getting the groceries. More about the routines. Still hopefully healthy enough where you feel pretty good, but less go, and less getting things done. So we sometimes see this stage actually expenses can actually scale back a bit versus what the first 10 years looked like because you're doing less of those other things. Something to be aware of in this stage is this is oftentimes when you start thinking more about healthcare and what that's going to look like for you long term, and then also if you ever needed long-term care, how do you cover that? So those are some of the things to start thinking about. And then the last 10-year clip, again, plus or minus, depending on your time, is what we call the no-go years. A lot of times this is, you're at a later stage of life, you're not feeling like you want to go do anything really. You don't want to go traveling. You just want to stay home, spend time with your family, things like that. But this is where the shift really goes into more of the health and covering the need there. And this is one of the big things to think about here is, what do you want that to look like for your family? If you ended up needing care towards the end of your life, do you want to put it on your children? Do you have a plan in place where you could bring a professional in to help with that or go to a facility? Most people, if you ask them, do you want to end up going to a facility? The answer is no. So if not, what's the plan? And so important to have these. And I would highly suggest what you don't want to do is wait until you get to this stage and be like, all right, time to put a plan together. Because then it could be extremely costly to your retirement plan. And you may not be in a position any longer to even do that. I'm going to give you a couple ideas of what can be done with long-term care and another pitfall here. So how to avoid treating retirement as a one-time event? Again, it's just planning for these phases and what they're going to look like. And it could be different for every household. Talk to your spouse if you have one. Think about what is it you want to accomplish in each of these segments. The first 10 years, the middle 10, the last 10. Review and adjust your plan annually at least. So your plan, it's not a set it and forget it type of plan. Things change. Spending changes, markets change, taxes change. You have to keep up with your plan. We have the tools in our client dashboard that you can use to simulate some of these things. And again, we can, going into our next pitfall here, we can test this against different stages as well. And then the last thing here is just focus on having a holistic plan. So looking at not just these things as silos, but how do your income and your taxes and your health care, how do those all work together to accomplish what you're trying to do in your retirement? So it brings us to our next pitfall, over-reliance on market performance. This one, I think it can be easy to do given where the markets have been for the last 15 plus years. It's been so good overall. We really haven't had a lot of pain since the financial crisis, if you think about the stock market. So it can be easy to think, well, as long as things keep going the way they're going, I'm good. I don't really have to worry about it. But the problem is it may not keep going as it's going. You have to plan for adverse markets as well. And again, we haven't really felt a lot of pain. The only really down year we've had since the financial crisis was 2022, really. I mean, 2020 actually ended up being an up year, even though we had the COVID spike and then it shot way back up. So we haven't had a lot of pain, but this is especially true in the first stage of retirement, in the go-go years. If the markets don't cooperate in the go-go years, it can be disastrous for your long-term plan. So if you're taking money out, you're traveling, you're remodeling, things like that, and then the market's also going down, you don't have as much money there to recover when things start to stabilize in the market. We call this sequence of return risk, and I'll give you a quick example here, but if you've never looked at sequence of returns, anyone ever heard of that, sequence of return risk? Any? Couple people? Okay. It's important to understand, and it really especially affects you in your retirement income the first 10 years. It really doesn't affect you when you're working and earning and growing. Sequence of returns means nothing. It all of a sudden means something when it's time to retire. So I'm going to give you guys an example here. This is going to be a little hard to read, potentially, depending where you're sitting. But what I want to show you here is this is an example of two different couples, and all of the criteria on the left are the same. So they retire at the same time, they're age 65, they have $500,000, they're withdrawing 5% a year. Everything's the exact same. Except on the left, Paul and Carrie, they retire with their $500,000, and they picked a bad time to retire because the very first year, the market was down 27%. Now, has the market ever been down 27%? Yeah, it has, right? It just so happens that they were those guys that retired in 2007, right, when things got ugly. And then the next year, not so bad, but a 16% dip, and then it kind of stabilized from there. But look what happens. They're $500,000, they lost 27%, and now they still had to take their $25,000 for living their life, their lifestyle expenses. They've got $350,000 after the first year. And then they've got to do it again the next year. The market still isn't cooperating. Now they've got $267,000. That's when things start to stabilize and turn around. But now they're $267,000. It's a long ways away from that $500,000 that they started at, and it's a lot harder to get up there. Now, on the right side, you see Mark and Cheryl. They retired and things were rosy. It was great. So the first year, they're $500,000. It was up 26%. Now they're, even after they take their withdrawal, they're at $600,000. No worries in the world, right? Now, they see pain some places along the way, especially at the end here where they still have $1 million. But the main thing I want to drive home here is when most people look at their statements they get, especially when you're working, you look at that statement, you're looking at what's my average rate of return? What's my average return? 6%, 8%, 10%. And when you get into retirement income years, your average matters a lot less than the actual timing of the return. So for example, if I look at all these years on the left, over all those years, they averaged a 6% per year. On the right side, if I average all these years, they averaged 6% per year. So you had the same long-term average, but long-term average doesn't matter anymore. Now it's timing. If you have that bad market early in retirement, that's where it's hard to ever get back from. So I would put less focus on what is my 10-year average return and more focus on how am I positioned right now as I'm drawing income from my retirement savings. How to reduce reliance on the market? Well, a couple things. Yeah.
It's a great example. What control or influence do you have over sequence of returns when so much of it is dependent upon how the market's doing?
Well, that's actually it right there. You have zero control over the sequence. You can't control anything about that. It'd be nice if we could just call Trump up and say, listen, I need this year to be a good one in the market, but we can't do that, right? So we have no control over that. So the only thing we can control is our own portfolio and our own strategy. So one of the things I would look at here, does anyone know what this is?
Well, it's a house.
Well, very good. I did not even think that looking at it. I'm like, what is that? Here, I'll put a little door here just to make it look, and a little window. So this is a house and with a large front yard / foundation. So the first thing I would look here, and this is one of the ways that you reduce your reliance on the stock market, is we talk about our MAP methodology here. So if you think of this is your whole portfolio, you don't want to put all your eggs in any one basket. We all have heard that for everything, right?
Yeah.
But especially for, when it comes to your retirement plan. So up here, what we're talking about is the market. Now, we really like the market because when the market's cooperating, it's great. We could be up 10, 20% a year, and we love that. But sometimes that doesn't cooperate. Sometimes it's down 20% a year. So we can't just put everything there and just cross our fingers and hope that, the problem with, by the way, if you have everything here and you have to live off your retirement savings, you have no choice but to take money out when it's down 20%. You have to sell it low. We want to avoid that. So we have a couple other things here. The A is the alternatives. Alternatives, and one of the things that we talk about here is especially things that would generate income. So regardless of their actual price performance, you can count on income in this bucket. So some things you might hear, up here you're going to see things like stocks, ETFs, mutual funds, things like that. In the middle, you might see things like structured notes. You might see bonds. You might see, in some cases, you could look at an alternative being like a real estate holding that maybe isn't exactly correlated with the market, although be careful with real estate, REITs and things like that, because those can sometimes have more risk than intended. But structured notes, bonds are great examples. And then at the bottom, we have what we would call protected. In other words, regardless of the external factors, your money is protected in these accounts. Now, this would be things like CDs, certain types of annuities, could be like money market accounts, things like that. Now, every stage has a trade-off. Just like in life, everything has a trade-off, right? So the trade-off with the market is even though you can have a massive return, you could also have a massive loss. There's no guarantees with the stock market. You got to be willing to ride the flow of the market. With the alternatives, we don't have an absolute guarantee, but what we do is we generally have a hedged protection built into that. So you're taking some risk, not all of the risk. Okay, think of it as an in-between between fully protected and fully at risk. That's your alternative. And then the protected, you have a 100% guarantee against loss, but you're going to be more conservative on the growth side. Okay, so you might try to average 5 to 7% with this money, where this money you're trying to average 12 to 15%. But it's how you compose all of this together. So if we go through, let's say we go through a very turbulent market and you're early in retirement, we want to be able to either count on income that's being generated from your portfolio, or if we need to take distributions, we don't want to take it from here. We want to look at what do you have that didn't take a hit. And that's why you build it strategically like that. So a couple ways to do it. You can build it to generate yield, or you can simply say, I want the assets all to be growth focused, but some more aggressive and some more conservative. But that way you have options when it comes to it. The other thing is, the ability to adjust not only your investments, your investment plan, but also your withdrawals. If you build in the flexibility where, hey, if it gets really rocky, I could scale back my withdrawals for a few months or a year or two because maybe you've padded your savings, for example. That's a great place to be as well. So you can let the market recover without going and selling off your portfolio. So several things that we can do there. Okay, pitfall 3, not stress testing your retirement income. So does anybody know what I mean when I say stress testing? Is that familiar? Not really? So when we say stress testing, when most people look at planning for retirement, they're looking at average scenarios. If we assume everything's average tax rates, average inflation, average market performance, that's how they're building a plan. And that's a fine way to build at least a baseline plan, but it's also important to stress test that plan against some adverse scenarios. What happens if taxes go up? What happens if the market doesn't cooperate? What happens if inflation runs away? All these things, right? So what what can happen is if someone just only ever looks at average scenarios, they could have some false confidence about their plan when things aren't average. And then that can cause knee-jerk reactions. And the last thing you want to do with your long-term strategy is have a knee-jerk reaction. You don't want to be like, oh man, market's all of a sudden not cooperating, sell everything. That's not having a plan, okay? That's having a reaction. So, give you an example. This is also in our client dashboard. And if you wanted to go to this on your own, if you go to the retirement tab, and again, we're happy to show you guys this, but if you go to your retirement tab, and then you click on stress test, what you can do is you can look at these different scenarios. I know this is hard to read, but we start with the baseline scenario, and then in this situation, what I'm looking at is, what happens if the stock market dropped by 20% immediately? What does that do to the plan? And what you want to see here with your income plan is it doesn't really affect the probability of your plan. Now, if you notice that, man, the market's dropping and now all of a sudden you have a 50% chance of your income plan, that's not good. We got to look at how do we address that. Social Security being reduced by 20%. That's another option. Now, there's a lot of uncertainty about Social Security, and I think there's a chance that we see some kind of restructuring of the program. Whether it affects your income or not, who knows? I would hope not, but you never know. So you could look at your plan and say, what if they did claw back some of my benefit and say, hey, it's for the greater good of all, right? What does that look like for me? Am I still going to be okay? So we can actually test that scenario. What if inflation was higher than we anticipated? What if my asset return was lower? What if my taxes were a little higher than I projected they would be? Here's a good one too. What if I live longer than expected? Maybe and I see this all the time. I meet with people and they're like, yeah, put us in for 80. By then we'll be, and I'm like, well, hold on a second, we might want to plan for longer than that. But what if you live longer than you thought? Are you still good? Does that affect your plan? Or does that cause too much stress on the income?
Is that in my capital?
It is. Yep. It's right in there. Yeah, and like I said, we're happy to show you guys how to do this too. But that's a great way to do it. Now, in this particular scenario, they're all at 100%. But what will happen is if you stress test your plan, there might be some of these bars that start coming down. Now, if they go below, like a 90% probability, you probably want to start asking, is there something I could do to mitigate that? Especially if it's a risk you think could be real for your portfolio. If you're concerned about it, what could you do to address that risk? You never want to address a risk like this reactively. Something bad happens, and then you're like, okay, now I need to address that. That's not a good strategy. You want to address things before they happen in your retirement plan. Okay, like I said, you get to test good, bad, and ugly scenarios. Of course, we love the good scenarios, but it's also important to look at the bad scenarios. What if it doesn't go as planned? Identify weak points. And like I said before, adjust before problems happen. You don't want to be reactive with your long-term plan. All right. How are we doing on time? Because this is a long one. Okay. Underestimating taxes in retirement. That's a big one. There's a lot of things that can affect your taxation in retirement. So I'll go through these, and I've got a couple examples in here we'll touch on. But the first one, wrong assumption about being in a lower tax bracket. How many people were told, like, all your working years, like, hey, don't worry, when you retire, you'll be in a lower bracket and it'll all work itself out. You ever hear that? Oh, yeah. And how many of you got to retirement and are like, where's my lower taxes? Right? So that's a common misconception is people just assume, well, when I'm retired and my income's gone, yeah, it's going to be a lot lower. But then, well, they did a good job saving. Now they have Social Security. Maybe there's a pension. All of a sudden, it's like, why am I being taxed so much? So that's a big one. RMDs create problems later. Anybody know what age RMDs start? 73 now, yeah. So it's changed a couple times. It used to be 70 and a half, and then it was 72. Now it's 73, and depending on when you were born, it could be even later than 73 because it's tiered to go all the way up to 75 at some point. So what happens with RMDs sometimes? Now let's just play out a scenario here. Let's say you're 65, you retired, you're like, oh, I don't need to worry about RMDs for 8 years. I'm good. I can have like no income and pay no taxes for the next 8 years because, yeah, I have money in the bank and I have savings and whatnot. So we see this happen where people are like, I'm going to just pay like little to no taxes because I deserve it. I worked hard all those years. Now I don't want to pay anything. And then what happens is they suppress it, and you could do that in some cases. Then all of a sudden, RMDs come, and they just get absolutely hammered with taxes because they had never taken anything or planned for anything. So in most cases, it's important to not work in extremes. And I understand, like, I want to pay zero taxes too. No one wants to pay taxes. But sometimes paying some tax to avoid a much larger tax later is a good thing. And I'll give you a little example of that here too. Widow tax penalty. This is a big one, and it's not a fun one to think about. And this is not an actual penalty that the IRS imposes, but it's a ghost penalty. So if you're a married couple and you're filing joint return, and all of a sudden it's just one of you, well, you still have the same assets, IRAs, so on, but now you're a single filer. That single filer is essentially penalized in that scenario. So I do have an example of that I'll show you guys. Poor coordination of account types. Anyone ever seen us do the buckets? Taxable, tax deferred, tax free. So if you haven't really thought about that or coordinated your buckets properly over the years, that's another one of those scenarios. You get later in your life, taxes end up going up. You're like, you don't have options because you didn't plan for it. IRMA. So if you're working, you never really thought about IRMA. What is IRMA? Right? It's nothing to you. You're not on Medicare level or anything. Once you are 65, they're going to look back at your income and say, oh, you made too much? Pay more for Medicare. That's what IRMA is. So I'll give you guys a little idea of what that looks like. But that's another one. It can creep up on you all of a sudden. Remember you were supposed to have less taxes? Why are you paying all these massive IRMAs? Oh, because you did a good job saving. So pay in more for your Medicare. Missed opportunities in lower income years, kind of along the same lines, but I'm going to show you guys an example. So, and then the last thing is potentially bigger tax bill for your heirs. Now, some people don't care about that. They're like, that's fine, that's their problem. They're getting the money, they pay it. But if you had the option between your, let's say your grandchildren receiving more or the IRS receiving more, which one would you pick? Grandkids. You know, I know you wouldn't pick the kids, but grandkids, right? So those are things to think about. Even though it might not be your goal to maximize every penny you send them, if you can still be strategic and help them keep more of it versus the IRS keep more, might be worth looking at in your retirement. So let me give you a couple examples. Here's the widow tax example. And this is just a quick scenario, but let's say that it's married filing jointly, you got 2 Social Securities, a pension, IRA, but the big thing is the total income is $96,000 and the tax bill is like $8,400 a year. It's effectively a 7% marginal rate. So reasonable, you know, everyone's happy, paying some tax, but nothing too crazy. Well, what happens is, if all of a sudden one of them is single, first of all, you lose one Social Security. You lose the lowest of the 2. So now there's one Social Security. If there's a pension, maybe you get half. But now you've got all the IRA dollars in one name. So if there's RMDs, or even if there's not RMDs, if there's just a need to take money out to pay for the bills. So let's say the total income was the same. If the total income stays the same, the tax bill goes to $11,500 or 12%. So it's kind of a ghost tax, if you will. It's not, you don't see an actual penalty on your tax bill, but all of a sudden you're paying way more than you thought just because you hadn't planned. Now the solution to that is just tax planning while you can. So you're married filing jointly, maybe there's more space in your tax bracket, you say, hey, let's make some strategic moves. Let's do some Roth conversions or take a larger distribution this year or things like that. This is just a quick glance at the Medicare premiums. This is IRMA essentially. So you can look at, and I'll just focus on the joint return for example, but if your total income is over those thresholds on the joint return, you'll see an increase in your monthly Medicare, and this is the latest data on that. So it's something that you have to think about. Also, if you're going to do things like a Roth conversion, is it may bump your IRMA up a bit. sometimes it still makes sense to do that. Because you look at the long-term benefit of doing that conversion, and you're also in the state of Florida, so you pay 0% state tax, where maybe in the past you paid 5, 6, 7%. But it is something to be aware of. You know, IRMA is affected. If you had 1 year, by the way, that you had a very large IRMA, but then the year after that your income stabilized, you can file with Social Security and Medicare to say, hey, that was an anomaly year. Don't charge me IRMA again. You know, so if that happens, you want to make sure you did that, yeah?
No, well, we tried.
Okay.
Several times, we never got.
There are certain qualifying events, yeah, that
Oh,
don't
it
let you
was
do that.
qualified, we just never got a relief from it. I don't
We
know.
went to the Social Security office in person 3 times.
Did you?
Signed the same papers,
You have to bring a baseball bat.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
But we got stuck paying that high premium for 2 years.
Okay. Yeah. It exists, yeah, for sure. Did you have a quick question? Yeah.
If you do one large Roth conversion,
Yeah.
just 1 year,
It'll affect it for 1 year.
well, I was gonna say, can you use the appeal? Because that kicks in like a year or 2 down the line.
It's 2 years, yeah, it's 2 years look back. So for example, this is the 2026 premiums and it's based on your filing in 2024. So if you did that in 2024, now you could try to make the argument like they did to say, hey, that was a one-time event. If it was a Roth conversion, I think they're probably gonna say you're gonna pay it. But if it was, you know, hey, it was my final year of retirement, I got a massive bonus and golden parachute package, maybe they would say, well, that was a one-time anomaly. I don't know. You could try it. I mean, I would always say try it, but didn't work out. Yeah, it didn't make a difference there. Some of these things too, it depends who you talk to.
If we pursued it with them, is there ever an instance where retroactively they will go back and, you know, look at what we paid and see it was a one-time and sort of give us a refund on?
I would say there's been examples of things like that happening. So we had one recently that we helped a couple that didn't realize that they were eligible for a benefit, and 2 years had gone by, and we helped them fight for it, and they ended up getting retroed back what they're. So in your situation, I don't know in your situation, you know, but I would say it's worth a shot, you know.
It was a sale of a practice.
Okay, gotcha.
In the house. the same
Yeah.
year. It was huge.
So potentially, yeah. All right, so how to reduce and manage your taxes in retirement. So coordinate your withdrawals across multiple, and again, this is, again, the scenario if you look at, you know, you could suppress your income and just live off your bank money for, let's say, 5 years, but at the expense of paying much more taxes later because you never touched your IRA money. There's things that you could do along the way to benefit in both ways. Use those lower income years strategically. You don't necessarily want to pay $0 in tax, even though it sounds great. That could actually hurt you later, okay? And then model taxes over time, not just this year. Another thing I'll say here is if you work with a CPA or a tax preparer, you got to remember that they're in the business of this year. They're generally not looking out 5, 10 years for you and saying, well, if you do it this year, you're going to benefit in 5 or 10 years. Their goal is for you to benefit right now. And I know that's good too. You need that too. But sometimes at the expense of down the road. So it's just marrying those things and making sure it's a good strategic plan for you. All right, number 5. 15 minutes? Okay. Claiming Social Security without a strategy. And we sometimes see this, especially if there's preconceived notions that people have. They say, hey, that's going bankrupt. I'm taking it at 62 as soon as I possibly can because I want to make sure there's something left for me. And that's emotional, I would say. It's an emotional decision. I'm not saying there's no truth to be alarmed that the program is going underwater, but that's maybe not the best way to make that decision is based on something like that. So what we really recommend with Social Security is looking at it from a lot of angles, not just one. It's a big decision. It's a big one-time decision. And sometimes the areas that people don't really think too much about is how will this affect my spousal benefit or my survivor benefit? If my spouse was maybe a stay-at-home parent and they didn't have a lot of earnings, how would I get them to have a reasonable Social Security? That's a spousal benefit. They're eligible for up to 50% of your benefit as long as you wait till full retirement, for example. Or a survivor benefit. Sometimes we see the higher wage earner that was just so tired of waiting, and at 62 they took it, but the lower wage earner was going to wait because now they had this big benefit they didn't need to wait. Well, now for the rest of both of their lives, that is a reduced benefit, regardless of who's around. So there's a lot to think about, short-term, long-term. There's a couple things you can do in our system if you're trying to make a decision about Social Security. Some of you may have already done this, or maybe you're coming up on it, but what we can do is we can look at optimizing it. And just because it's the mathematical optimal way to draw doesn't always mean that's the final decision. There's other things that could factor in. But if you just look at the optimal way, this is just an example of, we can compare a base strategy. So you might say, hey, if I met with you and you said, well, I'm going to take mine at 65 and she's going to take hers at 62, we can go into our system, say that's their plan. Now what's the optimal plan and what's the difference between the two? And then you can start to say, well, what's the actual value of maybe doing it differently? And you still may not do that, or you may meet somewhere in the middle, but it's important to understand what you're potentially trading off by making those decisions. And then sometimes you hear people talk about, well, what's my break even? So you can also do that in the system here, break even analysis. Like in this example, if I look at the current strategy, what they were going to do versus the optimal, well, 80 years old is the break even point. In other words, as long as you lived to 80, you were better off going with the optimal strategy. If you think about it just, if you just think about it like, same thing with retirement income planning. If you only need to plan for 5 or 10 years, just take your Social Security. But the reality is we probably need to plan on a much longer period of time. So in a lot of cases, it makes sense to have a larger benefit for a longer period of time. That's in our system as well. So coordinate it with your plan. Consider longevity and survivor benefits. That's a big one. You can also kind of stress test that. What if I live to 90 and she lives to 85, or vice versa, or we live longer than we thought? You can look at how does that affect your plan before you make that decision, okay? And also the tax implications, which has changed at least until 2028 a little bit, just because of the bonus deduction, which we talked about in October. Okay, 2 more. Ignoring healthcare and Medicare planning. I'm not going to spend too much time on this one, but a lot of confusion on what exactly does Medicare cover, how do those costs work. You have options. A lot of times people look at, what is a Medicare Advantage? I'll say we, as the advisors, don't get too deep into that, but we do have a resource where if you're really wanting to understand Medicare and what's best in your situation, we can have you, meet with our colleague that can break it all down for you, and she's really good. So if you're unsure about that, let us know. The big thing I would say here too is not having a long-term care plan. That is something that we deal with regularly. So I think I'll talk about it a little bit in this section here. So long-term care, if you look at most ways to cover long-term care, it gives you heartburn, because they're saying, well, yeah, we want you to pay a premium. You're going to have very restrictive benefits that may or may not need someday, and your premiums are going to go up. And then by design, you turn 85 years old, they start squeezing you out of the plan because they just make it unaffordable. And so in most cases, unless you have a very old long-term care plan that's got a price lock, which they just don't do anymore, it may not make sense to go that route, unfortunately. It's just, a lot of times it doesn't make sense. So what we would tend to favor for people is if you can, again, it's all situational, but if you can have an asset-based plan. And I'll give you a quick example. Let's just say that you had, and this would fall into this protected bucket, but let's just say that you had $100,000 that you put into, and a lot of times these are either a life insurance or a long-term care hybrid. It could be, a life insurance or an annuity long-term care hybrid. But the difference being, these are actually asset-based plans. So you don't pay a premium or anything like that. but you do earmark part of your portfolio towards it. So I'll use an example of $100,000. Now what this might do, and again, these are all hypotheticals, but give you a good idea of what this does. They might say, okay, well today, if you needed long-term care, you know, that would give you $250,000 of care benefit. But we know we don't need long-term care today, right? They say, well, it's going to go up every year, and usually what we look at is like by 85. By 85, maybe it's, you know, $450,000 of benefit. So the $100,000 itself is extremely conservative. You really don't, you're not going to earn a lot on that $100,000, but how it works is you get a significant multiplier if you need care. And that's the key word. If you need care, there's a much larger bucket that you can now access. If you never need the care, which is the hope that we don't need long-term care, your beneficiary will get the $100,000 with a modest interest rate, like 2% a year or something like that. So they'll still get it back someday. Your beneficiary is going to get something back for that. But if you ever need it, at least you have access to a larger bucket and you can protect some of your portfolio from coming out without paying premiums, without worrying about them denying you. The kicker on something like that is a doctor has to certify that you need help with 2 of the 6 activities of daily living. Okay, so as long as a doctor certifies that, it unlocks this bucket, and now you can use that for care. So just one other way to think about long-term care, if you haven't addressed it yet, and you have the ability in your portfolio, you might think something like that, just to have the peace of mind that if I ever need it, it's there. I've got something there. All right, again, and also as far as Medicare or even health insurance in between, if you're retiring early, if you need help with that, contact us. We can get you guys set up with someone that's an expert in that as well. All right, last thing, not prioritizing or updating estate planning. I would say, well, I would start with not prioritizing. A lot of times this isn't fun to prioritize. Nobody wants to think about, you know, what happens when they're gone and things like that. But has anyone ever dealt with a messy estate plan? You know, a parent or something like that that just never really got it together, and now the siblings are squabbling over it, and happens all the time. So we just never know when our time has come, right? So it's important to have this as a foundation of your plan, to know that if, God forbid, something happened to us, we've already set up a trust, our wills, power of attorneys, and it could just be a situation where you're still here, but you're incapacitated. If you haven't set up power of attorneys and things, it's very difficult, you know, from a medical standpoint and a financial. So that's what this is talking about. Now, we also run into people that maybe 20 years ago they set up a trust and they haven't even thought about it since. They haven't really touched it. It's probably a good idea to revisit that plan. I mean, we recommend when it comes to estate planning, at a minimum, you should go through all your documents every 3 to 5 years. Now, with your financial plan, your retirement plan, that should be at least every year, because there's a lot going on there with taxes and income and investments and so on. With your estate plan, the hope is there's not a ton going on all the time, but every few years you should be looking at that. You know, maybe you have a grandchild that was born that you want to name them as some part of your plan, or, you know, your brother upsets you and you want to take him out, or whatever it is, right? So very important to update that. And then also to align your beneficiaries with your plan. Sometimes we meet people and they think that, well, regardless of what I set my beneficiary on my account, I have a trust. The trust will dictate where everything goes, my trust and will. And that's not true. Your beneficiaries will supersede your trust on your accounts. So it's important to make sure that if your trust kind of lines up what your trust and your will line out what your goals are or what your intent is, that your accounts also match that. Otherwise, your accounts are going where they're named to go, and it may not be part of your long-term plan. So, also, like I mentioned, planning for incapacity, not just death. That happens. You know, you're in a hospital, you can't make your own decisions. A million reasons why that could happen, but to have the ability to have trusted people in your life be able to help with that, and you have to do that ahead of time. You don't do that when you're incapacitated, you do it beforehand. So very important stuff. So biggest pitfall of all, not having a strategy. We also see this a lot, but being reactive, not thinking about things ahead of time, not having a 10, 20, 30-year plan, just going with the flow, crossing your fingers, hoping things work out, not a good plan. Investment, taxes, income, healthcare, all working together. I brought this one up because this is the goal of our firm, okay? We just brought on estate planning recently, so we can help with that in-house. We do, of course, the investment management and the income planning. We are working towards getting tax planning internally. And when I say tax planning, I'm talking about an actual tax preparer as part of the team that can do tax returns and things like that. So one of the biggest concerns we get from people is like, who do you recommend for taxes? And we're like, that's a tough question, because it's hard to find great people for that. And sometimes when you do, now you've got your tax person over here, your estate person over here, your advisor, and now you're trying to coordinate three, and it can get messy. So our goal as a firm, just to give everyone an update, is to bring that in-house and to be able to do everything. So we're 2 years ago. Realistically, in the next 12 months. Yeah. So hopefully sooner, but that's the goal. Yeah.
On your last slide, you said have a strong power of attorney.
Yes.
Define strong.
Well, I think it's when you go to make those decisions ahead of time, you have to think about the person. So I'll give you an example. There's two main types of power of attorneys. There's your health power of attorney to make healthcare decisions, and your financial. And a lot of times people will just name one person for both. And that person may be a great healthcare person because they were in the medical field and all that, but they are not who you want as the financial power of attorney. They're just not good at decision making with money and things like that, or vice versa. So when you think about your power of attorney, you want to think through what that actually looks like. You don't want to name someone as the financial that they've just never been good with money. You know, or name someone as a healthcare attorney that they just get so squeamish. The thought of even making a medical decision, they wouldn't be able to do it. They would be paralyzed too, you know? So I just really thinking through that. I mean, it's, again, not fun to think about, but making sure that that's the person that could do that. And I think it's also good to, if you have someone named as a power of attorney, they should know that they are your power of attorney and what that actually means. So, yeah, so yeah, that's kind of what that means. But so that's the biggest thing. Put it all together. Retirement evolves. Your plan should evolve. Again, this is kind of a January 2026. Let's be thinking about what could go wrong with the plan. How do we address it ahead of time? Income being structured, stress tested. That's going to be situational on how you've set it up. But you know, as a firm, we're firm believers, no pun intended, in having part of your portfolio generate income if you need to generate income in retirement. Having everything coordinated, estate planning, protect your family. And then, as I mentioned throughout, I mean, these are things that we can help you guys look at. We have our client dashboard that can do a lot of the testing, the stress testing, the projecting, the looking at Social Security, things like that. If you're not sure how to use it, just let us know. We'll show you how to do it, or if you haven't been in there. Mm-hmm.
Is there an opportunity to sit with someone to take us through that portfolio?
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, we just need to set up a time and we can do that, yeah. And then if you aren't currently working with us, we're happy to talk to you and go through this and show you what it looks like, to be a client with us. And I mentioned this last month as well. I don't know if any of you were here, but we did just launch our new estate planning coordination service. So that is live. So if you have, maybe you've never done it, or you haven't looked at your estate plan in 20 years, or you're one of those people that would fit that, we can potentially help you. So just set up a time to chat with us. We'll walk you through what that looks like and go from there.
In addition to the online tool, or replace the online tool? The current online
The dashboard?
Yeah.
That's completely separate offering, yep. That's completely separate, yep. All right, I think we did pretty good on time here. All right, so next month's topic is estate planning essentials as well. So we're going to be taking some time next month to talk about how some of these things work, the difference between a trust and a will, and the types of power of attorneys and things like that. What's a trustee? What's a grantor? So on. So we'll be going through that. But otherwise, that was the pitfalls. So hopefully, yes. Thank you guys. Yeah, thank you.